This is the audio-only version of the podcast. To watch the video and get more details and show notes, go to paancestors.com. This is Denise Allen with Your Pennsylvania Ancestors, and we're back with another episode about the Presbyterians in Pennsylvania with author Peter Gilmore. He wrote this book about Irish Presbyterians in early Western Pennsylvania. It's been published by the University of Pittsburgh Press a few years ago, and I was just really, really happy to be able to track down Peter and interview him. This book is wonderful. I say that about a lot of books and a lot of authors that I interview, but truly the early Pennsylvanians, if you're doing genealogy, becomes like just this massive gray goo, right? Like it's just like there's names and there's people on the census and there's some land records, but to understand how they interacted with each other, what their values were, what they treasured, how they spent their time, that information is in this book. So if you have those early Irish ancestors, or even if you don't, you have early German ancestors or Native American ancestors or African American ancestors, you're going to want to read this book because it's going to give you an insight as to how people acted with each other and what the culture was. So Peter is an absolute delight. We get into both the history of the Presbyterian Church a little bit, why people came here to Pennsylvania, and of course, some great stories about how they live together here. The link is in the show notes to purchase the book from University of Pittsburgh Press. I hope you get a copy so you can really learn about those early Irish Presbyterians. I am thrilled today to welcome author Peter Gilmore to the podcast. His ears were probably tickling in July when we had the Irish Institute for IGHR because David Rencher, the instructor, and I were fanboying and fangirling over this book, The Irish Presbyterians of Western Pennsylvania. We had each read the book, and it made a huge difference in how we thought about those sometimes pesky, elusive, early Scots-Irish or Ulster-Irish Pennsylvania researchers. And I was thrilled to find Peter through his church association in Pittsburgh. And Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. It's a thrill to be able to share with other people some of what I've learned.
So I do have to know, were your ears tickling? It was the last week of July.
Well, I don't think so.
Were you like, I think there's someone talking about my book? No, we really, this book, it's for people that haven't seen it, it's published by University of Pittsburgh Press. So it is an academic book publisher. You're not going to find it at Barnes & Noble, unfortunately, but I'll include a link in the show notes for folks to where they can find the book and purchase it. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book. So what is your geographic focus of this book? You say Western Pennsylvania, that's a big area. So where did you focus your research?
Well, mostly on the Southwest, or I suppose to put it in a modern setting, the Pittsburgh metropolitan region. My definition of Western Pennsylvania, though, is not unlike the Proclamation of 1763, the Western waters, the territory drained by the tributaries of the Ohio River. And a lot of the focus is on Washington County, which in the time period covered by the book, 1770 to 1830, was the most populous of the Western Pennsylvania counties. But of course, I also look at Westmoreland County, Fayette, Allegheny County, Butler, Beaver, and what was known as the Great Empty at the turn of the 19th century, modern Crawford, Lawrence, Venango counties.
Yeah, it's a vast area, and the Ulster Irish or the Scots Irish really pushed themselves into that area early. And you give us a clue as to what their life was like, unlike anything else I've ever read. So I think for modern folks, I don't know. I feel like in modern times, we kind of think like there's just like the Protestant religion, and then there's the Catholic religion, there's Jewish people, Muslims, like we have like these major categories, but the Protestant faith is like very diverse at this time. They have very wide-ranging views of how life is conducted. So these Irish Presbyterians, give us a little insight as to of what their life was like. Do you have a favorite story from the book or favorite kind of like vignette of?
Oh, sure. I mean, first of all, I would like to emphasize, as I try to in the book, the congruence of these two, the lapping nature of these two categories, Presbyterian and Irish, because in the 18th century, that was something unique. Arguably, it's unique in the 21st century as well, but particularly so then because the majority of the population then as now was Roman Catholic, with this small Protestant, by which I mean Church of Ireland Episcopalian elite who were the landowners, and kind of in between were the Presbyterians, mostly from Scotland, who suffered civil penalties under the law. Under the law, this is going to sound so strange to say this out loud, to hear this, but legally speaking, in the 18th century, Presbyterians weren't Protestants. They were dissenters. The only official Protestants were those who belonged to the state established church. Well, Presbyterians had theological issues with that church, and the communicants of the church included their landlords, with whom they weren't always on the best of terms. So getting out from underneath the state and the state church had a lot to do with, along with a myriad of economic reasons of why they came here. So to be Irish in the Pittsburgh area at the turn of the 19th century probably meant you were some kind of Presbyterian, and vice versa.
Right.
So this was a unique ethno-religious identity. And how did that manifest itself? Well, in a variety of ways. One of the curious things I found in my research was an ad for a farm. The farm was actually on the eastern shore of the Monongahela River in Westmoreland County, but the ad appeared in a Washington County newspaper. It talked about, of course, the acreage, the availability of a grist mill, and an navigable body of water to transport goods, and it was convenient to a Presbyterian clergyman. Well, in what strange universe is that a selling point in real estate? But, in the latter part of the 18th century in southwestern Pennsylvania, apparently it was. Another odd vignette, the final phase maybe of the Whiskey Rebellion, when things really got tense and even more violent, a federal marshal attempted to serve papers on one of those who failed to pay the tax. And it happened that there were people nearby gathering in the grain. They grabbed their muskets, shots were fired. The federal marshal tried to reason with the crowd and found that they spoke in a language peculiar to themselves, which arguably was the beginning of what we would now call Pittsburghese. Let's say, one could go on, but they established in a variety of ways that they were a different group of people altogether. Tended to, well, the first generation anyway, whether it's Washington County in the 1780s or where I was born and raised, Hillsborough County, New Hampshire in the 1730s, didn't marry outside of the group, didn't associate much with folks out of the group. They were who they were, and the rest of the world was probably going to hell.
Spoken like a Calvinist. Yeah, they had their way, you were one of our people or my people, and there was other people that they may be associated with.
And yet, at the same time, they amongst themselves as readily as they did with those outside of the group. So there were at any one time at least three or four, yeah, four denominations of Presbyterians, four different ways of being Presbyterian, and sometimes more, as one little denomination would split over one issue or another.
Interesting. So, how much did that Presbyterian faith influence their day to day life? I mean, people
Yeah,
always think about the Amish, and everyone thinks, oh, the Amish are so different and they, have different ways of being around each other. But were the Presbyterians like that too, to some extent?
to some extent, but here's sort of a paradox. There's the and I will admit that perhaps I fudged the distinctions a little bit in the book, but I mean, if you'll understand why, there there were those who were devout, whose life was really built around their faith, but in the totality of the group, it was in a particular identity which really defined who people thought they were. So one would have been very aware of having come from a particular background, but that didn't necessarily translate into attending meeting every Sunday. And anyone who goes to church frequently will be aware of a great influx on Easter and Christmas, people who flood into the sanctuary who might seem vaguely familiar, but you don't see them there week after week. Well, there's kind of, I mean, that's been true throughout Christendom for a very long time. And it's not unique to this particular group of people. But when I write about the intense revivals of the early 19th century, you know, the, this was a very big deal. People gathering in their hundreds and their thousands and gathering for, is it not a revival meeting as such, but for the Lord's Supper in the traditional Presbyterian manner. But when the ministers and the elders were thinking about, we need to have a revival of religion. We need to bring more people into our churches. To whom were they addressing their message? Was it the world as a whole? No, it was all those unchurched Irish Presbyterians out there who were aware of that identity, would so self-identify, but weren't necessarily showing up for the hours on hours every Sunday, because there would be a service that would last a couple of hours in the morning. There'd be a break for lunch. They'd go back for a lecture, you know, be together for another few hours. So it was serious business. It took all day, and that's just the Sabbath. There were also days of fasting and humiliation and Thanksgiving, where the expectation was all work would cease. Well, perhaps not everyone did that, but if you were a regular churchgoer, you would be expected to do so and might be censured. You would be censured if you did not. But there was always a penumbra encircling the smaller group of active participants in the faith. And this was as true in Western Pennsylvania as it was back in the province of Ulster in the north of Ireland.
Excellent. I You painted such a great picture for us of these folks and their meetings. And in fact, the cover of the book has what looks like one of these gatherings that you just mentioned.
That's exactly right. And I was so grateful for this cover. It represents the book and its contents very nicely. But that's the illustration. It's an illustration from the 19th century history, and it depicts just one of these gatherings. So to maybe put that in focus a little better, it was the practice of all of these different Presbyterian churches to celebrate the Lord's Supper just 2 or 3 times a year. not every week, not every day, not every month, but 2 or 3 times a year in conformity with the rhythms of agriculture. So maybe in the spring after sowing, maybe in the fall after reaping. And because it happened so seldom, it had an even greater emotional and spiritual impact. And it drew people together. I describe it as a ritual reintegration. It was a way in which the imagined community reinvented itself. And it meant that more than the number of people in a congregation might be present, people would come from all over in their hundreds, either share space in someone's home or pitch a tent in the woods or build a lean-to. And these would be 4 or 5 day events. And so it's because of that, of people coming together, of spending 4 or 5 days listening to sermons, singing songs, that revivals took place, because these are already moments of profound emotional impact.
Oh, that sounds wonderful though, doesn't it? I mean, to reconnect with maybe people like extended family and things that maybe you spread yourselves out across a county or two, and now, you know, you're finally reconnecting and you get to kind of just, I don't know, it just sounds, it's like, I guess that's what we do now with modern conferences, or at least we did before COVID,
Oh,
where people would get together. But it just seems so nice to just fellowship with people together like that.
and it also became the basis of and marriage,
Yeah.
because you're bringing together young men and young women who might not see each other very often, or might not have ever met. There you are, shyly looking behind a tree at this attractive person of the other sex, and wondering, maybe could I strike up a conversation? Well, this is precisely how some marriages came about.
It's a good way to spread out the gene pool a bit in your community.
In the absence of social media, what else?
Exactly, exactly. So the one kind of amusing part about when I was reading your book was about the people that sort of broke with the tenets of the faith. And I remember the one instance, like if you remarried too close or married too close within your family, the church would kick you out. They had a great, like, I guess you could say, oversight and management of the behavior of their members. They wanted people to conform to a certain standard. But the good news for genealogists is that the people would sometimes argue those cases like up the hierarchy of the Presbyterian Church, and so you can get some. It sounds like some extensive records of what had happened and what they were arguing for or against. Like, oh, I didn't do that, or it's not as bad as it seems, or I can be forgiven and let back in. Is that the case, or am I?
No, it is. It is. One of the joys of the book was knowing that I was putting into print the names of what would be otherwise forgotten, relatively obscure people. I mean, and once in a while you come across a name that you're going to find cross-referenced in the history book. But mostly these are ordinary people who, for one reason or another, find themselves before the church courts, as they were called, either pressing a case or more likely defending themselves against someone else's accusations. But still, so these names are captured. But on that point, what I found really fascinating, and which something that touched me deeply, is that while yes, the sessions were monitoring the lives of people within the congregation, this is something that individuals agree to willingly. And
True.
and that was just astonishing to me, that there was a sense that we need care, we need direction. We're not on this earth on our own to do whatever the heck it is we feel like doing, but we, just as other people are looking out for us, we have an obligation to look out for others. And that was reflected, of course, in other ways in everyday not unique, of course, to this particular ethno-religious group, but like other people on the frontier or the near frontier, post frontier, it's not easy to raise a barn. It's not easy to raise a house. It's not easy to bring in a crop of wheat or barley or rye in the field, or to husk a great amount of corn. It's an occasion for people to get together, and that's always a good thing. But it's part and parcel of that interaction that denotes a community, that builds a community.
You're really reminding me too. I'm using my modern mind, like, oh, they must not have wanted to be managed like that but maybe that's the way I'm looking at it. Like, oh, well, didn't they want to be free and just to be able to do whatever they want? It's like, no, they wanted to be in relationship with the church and with each other. They didn't, and that came a certain set of responsibilities and guidelines and standards of behavior that good for them for upholding that on the frontier amongst what must have been a little bit of chaos and unsuredness and in terms of everything, food, security, health. I mean, I can't imagine.
So it had a practical benefit. It had a psychic and emotional benefit, and it, it was of cultural significance because they were replicating the experiences of life either back in the Cumberland Valley or Lancaster County or across the Atlantic in County Donegal or County Antrim.
Mm. I got some of those County Donegal genes. It's apparently there's enough mutations there that you can follow through. It's kind of funny, I think. People can be so that there's a genetic imprint on people that passes down like hundreds of years just based on where they live. But what else do you want readers or future readers to know about your book and about these Irish Presbyterians in Pennsylvania?
One thing that also struck me was not unlike a lot of other Americans in the backcountry, their decision making and way of life was not oriented towards individual material success. So there was a calculus of decision making that also included cultural and spiritual factors. Instead of, is this going to be immediately good for myself or maybe my family? What does it mean for my eternal soul? But also, what does it mean for the neighborhood? What does it mean for the community? And I loved finding the letters written by parents back in Ireland to the younger generation settled in Western Pennsylvania. Do not store up your treasure in worldly things. The silver and gold are mine, saith the Lord. And they were serious, so astonishing that there are some things more important than immediate financial gain. So, one of the stereotypes, and this is people with multiple contradictory stereotypes, is money conscious, materialistic, while at the same time somehow being very religious. And that's not always true. One of my favorite stories that I came upon in church records, these are session minutes, involved an individual who had gotten into a conversation with a neighbor at a, dare I say, manure frolic. Guys got together to clear out the barn of the year's accumulation. And once all that was done, they're sitting around with whiskey, having a chat. The talk, of course, turned to the wheat crop, and the man whose barn had been mucked out allowed as how his wheat crop was particularly good, and intimated that one of the men present could help himself to some of the seed in his garner. I'd never seen the word garner used as a noun before. That's at the mill. And the man the second person did help himself. And the rumor developed that he had taken more than he should have done. And so the man who was accused of having taken too much seed brought charges before the session against the man whose it was that he had engaged in unchristian conduct by spreading this rumor that he had, feloniously taken too much of the wheat. And the session agreed that the issue wasn't one of, that guy is a thief, but
Yeah.
rather the other guy had behaved inappropriately by spreading, which is not what you'd expect necessarily. That happened in the late 1820s, which surprised me because it's, relatively late. There was another case I found from the 1780s, a bit earlier, of a member of the congregation who complained that he had been denied privileges at the local grist mill, which was owned and operated by another member of the congregation. And so the issue for the session didn't turn around question of whose property rights were involved, but rather that this was unfortunate, unchristian acrimony, a division within the community, and they arbitrated the matter so that the aggrieved party could, in fact, get his grain milled at the mill.
Wow.
So there's this emphasis on community, which supersedes what we might perceive as individual rights or individual advantage, which was the norm. Oddly enough, it seems so otherworldly, but it was. These are incidents that took place right around here in Western Pennsylvania among people with a different time, different circumstance. Might have been reading the same Bible as we do now, different translation probably, but it had a different interpretation. And we're interpreting what they read, what they heard from the pulpit in a way that was consistent with the necessity of trying to create a meaningful life as this region came out of the frontier state.
Yeah, it sounds like they it sounds like they wanted the whole community to succeed or survive or thrive together versus one person standing up and taking all the credit or being the most successful or would that be a fair
I
way
think
to look at them?
I refer to it as independence through interdependence.
Oh, that's a nice way to put it. Yeah. Yeah. Because we don't get a lot. I think sometimes people look at Pennsylvania and they're like, well, you don't have a lot of famous Pennsylvanians. We talked about James Buchanan, being really, like the only US president from Pennsylvania. I mean, you can say Joe Biden, but he was in Delaware. Like he lived in Delaware too. I mean, he was born in Pennsylvania, but
Right.
didn't grow up here, really. Didn't spend most of his adult life here. And so, people look and they're like, well, what happened there? Like, because you can only, famous people from Massachusetts and Virginia and, New York is always, and it just seems like a part of our culture, as because the Quakers were like that too, very egalitarian and very sharing. And I don't know what I'm trying to say there, but it just seems like we just have a low key, like, kind of energy to the state.
Well, and yet there's Pittsburgh and its mills and forges, smoke, that also came out of the resourcefulness and sense of industry and sense of calling that a later, mostly a later generation of people of Irish Presbyterian background would demonstrate. And not, of course, not exclusively owners of mills. As late as 1850, maybe as many as a quarter of the Irish American working force in the mills were people of Presbyterian background.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
So
I
people who are hardworking and and built something. And also, there are so many, again, this is a people with so many stereotypes, hard drinking, hard fighting,
Right.
uh, but also apparently prone to start universities. I was doing my research. I was beginning the research when the the book by the former U.S. Senator Born Fighting came out. Uh, Yeah, but I'm dealing with an area which produced Rachel Carson and Mr. Rogers. I could call my book Born Pacifying, and that would be equally accurate.
Yeah.
So there were the folks who were counting their pennies in Pittsburgh, but at the same time in northern Indiana County, their cousins were building illicit stills in the hills. And, it coming out of the same original cultural. So it it's these are cautionary tales against stereotypes.
It is funny. When you research, you do develop like you start. At least I do. I start generalizing about the people I'm researching, and then sure enough, there's something that blows that out of the water pretty quickly. And I realize I can't generalize. I'm walking in a far country here when I'm researching in the past. So.
That's right. And in terms of the Irish Presbyterians, they're as likely to psalm singing as they are whiskey drinking and fiddle playing.
I have one of those
And that's
couple years in my back.
it's all part of the package.
Yeah. I don't know about the whiskey part, but I do know about the other part. So what do you wish I had asked you about your book?
I could say more about the varieties of Presbyterianism and why they were even there.
Oh, I would love to know that because
Yeah,
I find the Presbyterian faith fascinating. So here's my story. I share this story a lot because I was at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania the one day and had pulled a Methodist circuit rider's, diary looking for a family in Northumberland County, so the eastern side of the state. But part of his diary recorded part of a ride that he took with a Calvinist and how he and the Calvinist got into quite an argument about the fate of men's souls. And he restrained himself from pushing the Calvinist off his horse, and the Calvinist did the same. And I just loved like it was just this little few sentences, but I had this picture of these two men just arguing about the fate of man. Like, could you redeem yourself through your deeds or not while you were on earth? Or was your fate, predestined by God before you were born? Like, I can see this argument. And I think, wow, our arguments today over politics are nothing compared to what these folks were really struggling with at the time in Pennsylvania. So do tell us about the various Presbyterian faiths. How much of them were the predestiners, predestined folks?
Oh, that would have been everybody. That's the question was not whether or not they would be Calvinist, but to what extent would they push the envelope. So lurking in the background, I suppose we should say, are the events of the 17th century, and without hopefully not turning this into a history lecture, which you probably don't want.
No, I want it. Trust me, I love history.
The Scotland had a rather protracted Reformation. What if the event that probably most people would be familiar with is 1560, Scottish Reformation commences, the Scots Confession is adopted, and a Presbyterian style of church government is enacted. But that isn't the end of the story. There was not a complete reformation. There's not a complete change in the manner of church government. And those issues were actually resolved decades later in the forerunner to what became the English Civil War. There was a covenant, the National Covenant, adopted, signed by tens of thousands of people in 1638, which essentially said, if the king were really thinking straight, he'd want this to be a Presbyterian church with no bishops whatsoever. The king didn't see things that way. And then came the English Civil War. The Scots Presbyterians, the English Puritans saw a basis for agreement, and the result was the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643, which to the English was mostly a military alliance. To the Scots, it was a solemn agreement with the English and God that all the British Isles would become Presbyterian. Well, that was disavowed by anyone in power after the Restoration. But that became the continuing basis of argument for generations to come. So the Church of Scotland and its sister churches in the north of Ireland no longer paid any attention to the covenants, but did embrace the Westminster Confession and Catechism, as did everyone who adopted a Presbyterian polity. But there were the outliers who said, no, the covenants, we made a solemn promise to God that we were going to do these things. They're still binding. And it doesn't matter that they were written in the 1630s, the 1640s. They're binding in every successive generation. So these divisions persist in Ireland, and they're brought over to North America. That's part of the reason why there are multiple Presbyterian denominations. So there's the mainstream church. There's the General Assembly. It's the larger body. But then there are the Associate Presbyterians, or Seceders, and the Associate Reformed, and the Covenanters, all of whom cling to the Westminster Confession and not to allow any amendment, any changes to those, and continue to insist that only psalms can be sung in worship, and that the covenants still have meaning. And so it's probably, as churches close and time goes by, it's probably less obvious, but for many years in Pittsburgh, you'll find Presbyterian churches within blocks of each other, and leading to a lot of head scratching. What's with all the Presbyterian churches? Well, the reason is because 100 plus years ago, 150 years ago, they were the churches of not just the one denomination.
Interesting. Yeah, people, you gotta know the history of the denomination in order to know how to research on the records too.
Well, that's right. And so the Seceders, or the Associate Presbyterians, who later merged, by the way, with the Associate Reformed to create the United Presbyterian Church, they were particularly strong on the western part of Washington County and numerous northwest of Pittsburgh, Butler, and beyond. So if you're looking for ancestors in Western Pennsylvania who you think might have been some kind of Presbyterian in, the first half of the 19th century, look to see if there are any records of associate Presbyterian churches or associate Reformed churches. And if you're lucky, you will find extant membership rolls or baptismal documents. See, unlike other Christians and unlike other Protestants, all of the Presbyterians recognized only two sacraments. I think with Lutherans and Episcopalians, there's three, but with Presbyterians, there's just the two: baptism and communion. So if you're relying exclusively or heavily on marriage records, you're not going to be as successful with Presbyterian. Okay. But baptismal records, yeah, that was very important. It was one of two sacraments. So very important.
Yeah, that's not too many. It's not enough. The Catholic faith has 7. So you,
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So you're operating with a smaller, much narrower range of available.
it's not as narrow as the Baptist, though. The Baptist, you get adult baptism, so you don't even get the infant baptism, and it's even more challenging. But we're not here to talk about the Baptist. So I love the bit of history of the church because it does give a perspective for people, and to know that they carried with them their whole history from their mother country. They didn't leave it at the door. They didn't come here and recognize it as America. They came here as solid as the Pennsylvania colony or the state of Pennsylvania, and they hung out and lived with and associated with people that they knew who shared their same values and sort of same ideals. Mostly, that's who they relied on the most. They were also worked with other people in their area, but to really look at people, I guess, because I'm saying all this because people get the idea from elementary school that they came here and they saw themselves as Americans, and we fought off the British and we all lived happily ever after as Americans. And it's like, well, it's a little more complicated. Have I told you about the Swedenborgians, or have I told you about, like, Pennsylvania's a complicated place, there's a lot going on here.
You can trace the movement of the Irish Presbyterians across the southern tier of Pennsylvania from the easternmost county to the westernmost in 2 ways: the organization of Presbyterian churches and the use of place names from the north of Ireland. That's obvious from the turnpike, right?
Right.
Here's the exit for Donegal. Here's the exit for Derry. But it's if you're really looking more closely at local family records, what you find is that not all the time, but in many cases, though, people, upon getting a land grant in the 1780s, would name their property after the townland from which they came in Ireland. The townland is the smallest geographic unit. Oh, I'm sure it's anyone who's done Irish genealogy has run into the townland. What the heck is that? Well, it's various size, but smaller than a parish. And you find townland names showing up as the names of farms across, well, certainly in Western Pennsylvania. And it says something, I think, of a mindset, of a worldview. These are the names of places where individuals grew up, where they first memorized the catechism, where their parents married, where their parents and grandparents may be buried, and that became the name of their farm.
So wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah, people didn't necessarily want to detach themselves from their past. They did want to honor it and keep it with them as much as they could.
For the first generation or two.
Yeah. Peter, I feel like our time's like wrapped up. I hope people enjoyed the history of this. And for those folks researching those elusive early Irish ancestors, do pick up the book, Peter's book, because it will clue you in. Even if they're not Presbyterian, you're still going to learn what it was like in early Western Pennsylvania for a good number of people. So even if you have German ancestors that are right up against these Irish Presbyterians, you're still sharing a life together at the grist mill and at the courthouse, and maybe intermarrying at some point. And I do hope people pick up the book and read it. And I just thank you so much for your time. This is really special for me.
You're quite welcome. It's been a delight.